Hello, Northstar here with another Cell Singularity Let's Play. Um, I apologize, my voice is a little less smooth than normal, and if I sound utterly exhausted, I am. I went for a 1 mile hike with my brother's mother-in-law today, and with my long COVID, I mean, that would not be before I was sick, that would have been nothing, but with this disability for those news channel, I'm disabled with long COVID. It sucks. Exercise takes an enormous amount of you physically and mentally with it. It's one of the reasons I'm too sick to work. Physical exertion is no go. And, well, many jobs are physical, including the job that I was qualified to do before. All of the jobs that I'd ever done before were much too physical for anything I could do with long COVID. And I can't think clearly enough to do more mental work, so. Um, I was gonna try and squeeze out a Rebel Inc. Let's Play today, but I don't even think I have the mental capacity to do that after that hike and talking to my brother's mother-in-law, who, on top of the hike and just talking with someone, taking some energy, well, talking is one of the easier things for me. If so, I don't have to think too hard. This mother-in-law I do have to think harder with because she's a enigma and from what I understand, a Trump supporter even now, and someone who never speaks her mind. So you're always trying to figure out what she really thinks, what she's after, what she's trying to suggest, or 'cause she's a very indirect person, and that's difficult when you combine it with the exertion of a hike because, yeah, it's bad, especially one of the things that happens with long COVID is about 2 or 3 years in. Seems to be somewhere in MECFS where there's a immune exhaustion phase about 2 or 3 years in. That's also been noted with long COVID. Um, so in the first 2 or 3 years, I was once able to hike a mountain. My muscles weren't as deconditioned at that point. After my brother's wedding, of course, that turned out to be a terrible idea. It took twice the time it would have taken me when I was healthy, and I could barely get out of bed for over a month after that. A month. That's not normal. A little muscle pain is normal. It wasn't even an insanely hard mountain. Although I did take a harder route on it. I was too much of a emotional high from, well, my brother just getting married. um, Feeling I could do anything, even though I knew very much I was disabled with long COVID and I couldn't. And yeah, it was a bad judgment call. But which we now know when people with long COVID overexert the muscles, it actually does permanent muscle damage. There's scarring in the tissue, so my legs will probably never be the same after that. I mean, all exercise can create a little bit of cell death, damage. That's actually part of what stimulates your muscles to get stronger. But with people with long COVID, when they had them do exercise for a research study, they found much more extensive damage and scarring. So, yeah, it's actually actively harmful and was stupid, but I loved, loved climbing mountains when I was healthy. I was a hiker. So, for my mental health, in a way, it was good to do something I loved one more time before I hit that immune exhaustion phase, which I had no idea was coming. Um, like, what, 10 or 11 months after that, and I could probably never do that mountain again. But I did a 1 mile hike, gradual uphill, level path, but slope. And that's kind of the most I should ever be doing anymore. One of the jobs I did was an EMT. I think I've talked about this in my streams before, so this is no big reveal. And I was healthy. I used to do that. And you used to like lift patients with the mechanical weight of a stretcher, but sometimes they wouldn't give you the. Sometimes on heavier patients, you're supposed to get assist, and they wouldn't. Dispatch wouldn't give you the assist you should be getting because they didn't have a unit available. So there's times where I'd end up lifting the equivalent of about 250 pounds of weight. Yeah, by the way, not with your arms. You lift with your legs when you're doing that because well, unless you're a super bodybuilder, it'd be pretty much physically impossible. You lift with the thighs, proper lifting technique. But yeah, I'm not someone who does 250-pound squats. That was brutally hard. This is like 500-pound plus pound patients that well, it's dangerous. I actually had a partner pull her back out on one of these 300 plus pound patients like that, which, that's like 175 pounds half when I was new, and I dispatched didn't want to give us an assist. And uh, my partner, who was much more experienced and should have known better, was indecisive about whether he should attempt it. I'm like, me being new and still full of bravado and confidence, like, oh, I'm sure we'll be okay. We were not okay. I was okay. I was younger. This partner pulled their back out and was never the same again. And having to take them to urgent care, like after that lift, after that patient. They weren't able to work again for like a couple months. This person's friends were so angry at me. It's like, I'm new, and it wasn't like I pressured this person. I just bad judgment call because I didn't have the experience to know that how bad it could be if it went bad. But you learn. One of the reasons it's such a problem, there's such high turnover of EMTs these days. We pay EMTs starvation wages. People don't stay in it. They don't get experience. And experience is very important in a job where you can get seriously hurt if you don't know what you're doing. I mean, you get trained, but there's stuff you learn from experience. Like what things you should and should not attempt when the rules say you're not supposed to attempt it, but if dispatch is not giving you an assist on a patient that it's heavier than you're technically supposed to lift, is this danger zone or not? Like how much? And it's less than you think that you can hurt yourself. But it's hard. It's hard if you're an EMT to push back against dispatch and say, no, I will not lift this patient because this is not an emergency. This is a routine transfer, and someone will get hurt if we attempt this, most likely. Like they will try and get revenge at you because it makes their life harder because then they have to move units around to. And let me be clear, in for-profit EMS, they are trying to keep as few units out there as possible to cut corners to maximize profit. This is why profit motive has no fucking business in the ambulance industry. Healthcare should not ever have the profit motive. I am a strong believer in the U.S. Medicare for all. That's not going to happen. The country's instead tending towards fascism now. But it is socialized healthcare and publicly funded ambulance services, profit motive, and health insurance and hospitals. Like profit motive ruins everything, and it undercuts when you have a public and a private sector. The private sector will undercut the public sector. You get politicians who intentionally underfund public services and sabotage them so they'll be privatized. And then say, oh, the public sector doesn't work. It doesn't work because you intentionally made sure it doesn't work. That's what's been happening in the UK to try and privatize the NHS. That's what's happening with what public services are made in the US. First, you ruin the public service. Then you say that the public sector can't do anything and therefore things should be privatized. The whole freaking thing is dishonest as hell. But anyways, sorry, it's a pain point for me. It's my own past. I know you. This is a clicker. This is not the most involved game. But I'm also, some of my mental filters kind of off right now. When I get really tired mentally, one of the first things that happen is my mental filter drops and I speak my mind more than I would when I'm not tired. That's especially been true since I developed long COVID. The effect was far less pronounced in the past. Some people, drink alcohol and they do that. No, for me, I get really tired and I become more willing to just speak, not necessarily like saying something controversial, but more like just become a bit of a blabbermouth when I'm tired. It annoys people sometimes. But, you know, YouTube streaming, you guys have to hear something, or just sitting here watching someone play and not talk would not be engaging. There's some channels that do that and they don't get many views for a reason. So, because this is partly a social experience of a sort. I think that's part of why people watch YouTube. Anyways, you know, there's literally YouTube channels where people just stream their everyday life. I could never do that. It wouldn't get creeped on, but you know, I, I've when I was on Reddit in the past, I received freaking death threats from fascists. I'm sure one of those people would find my YouTube if I ever did that and would like send me like death threats in real life, you know, in the mail. It's not something I need is the point. But enough philosophizing about the point of YouTube streams. I don't have to understand it to be able to do it, which is true of many things. Sometimes it just works. It's true of aspects of socialism, for instance. The most ridiculous and stupid thing is where you get people who make a priori arguments, or I'm not sure that's the right word, line phrase for it. You get people who make these purely theoretical arguments in ways that socialism must not work because of this theoretical reason, and then assume they'll set no evidence to indicate from actual, you know, pragmatic lived experience that shows they're wrong. I was just thinking about, like, you get like Mises and these right-wing libertarian bastards who try to claim socialism could any type of state-planned economy, including even just like Derrida's May capitalist economy, could not work because there's too many things to calculate, and so only the market can efficiently organize things. That's an argument. It's a bunch of bullshit, and the proof is in the pudding that it's not true. The Soviet economy actually had a higher long-term GDP growth rate than the United States. Yes, it was a less developed economy, and less developed economies typically do have higher growth rates, but it actually outperformed any economy at a similar GDP per capita in terms of long-term growth. I keep saying long-term because I'm saying, like, if you take beginning and end of any 5-year period, that's a 5-year average growth rate. The 5-year average growth rates will not every single 5-year period exceed the U.S. They usually did, and usually exceed any other. The periods they really didn't are in the crisis that was right around the collapse of the Soviet Union, after the U.S. scrapped the Bretton Woods global banking system unilaterally, because the U.S. had the power to do that. Nixon did that. It was actually a violation of several principles of international law, but no one could stop him, so Nixon did it. And the new global banking system that arose out of that was very bad for the Soviet Union. It allowed the U.S. to manipulate world trade in ways that hurt them, and so their economic growth slowed down, although it was still quite good. But it did slow down substantially, and the whole Soviet system had been built on, how would I describe it? In order to maintain public consent for the system, in order for people to continue to believe in the socialist project, it required fast economic growth, which it had enjoyed until like 1971, 72, right when Nixon was destroying Bretton Woods. After that, its GDP slowed, and even though its long-term growth rate still was, I believe, still the second highest in the world after, even then, until like 80 something, it was less. The whole world economy slowed down after the end of Bretton Woods. Or, well, not the whole. There were individual countries, there were winners and losers, but most countries, their economic growth slowed. I don't know if the global averages, because I think the U.S. economic growth rate was less affected in certain really large economies like Japan. It's just going to be quite large, actually benefited. But the majority of countries on Earth their economic growth slowed because of it. France actually got hit really hard by it, and they're a capitalist economy. um, but anyways, it really messed up France and the Soviet Union. Those are both countries that enjoyed considerable political instability due to the end of Bretton Woods. But I digress. A bit of blabbermouth, as I said, when I'm this tired. My point is that's an example of something that you don't have to know why it works. You don't have to have a perfect theoretical understanding of how the Soviet system managed to get around the problems of calculation. I mean, there were state planners of practical experience who were experts in that. But you don't have to have a perfect theoretical understanding of that to know that, in fact, it did get around those problems and enjoyed quite reasonable economic growth rates. People think the Soviet economy sucked because they didn't have consumer goods. They didn't have TVs, luxury cars. That's because their economic growth, there are different sectors in the economy. Almost none of it was in those things because the state planners intentionally diverted growth away from those sectors. Most of the GDP growth was in heavy industry, which people always say, oh, heavy industry equals tanks and airplanes. And I mean, yes, it helps the military, and that's part of why they diverted it. But it was also construction, infrastructure. So the growth of the rail network, the growth of the cement industry, steel manufacturing, those kind of things. A lot of it has obvious military implications, such as growing steel production and other critical minerals. But heavy industry, infrastructure, scientific research. The Soviets invested very heavily in scientific research and actually produced a lot of breakthroughs in certain fields. There's a reason that they were the first to space, and that's because they invested very heavily in research for such a still poor country. They never caught up to the US, even though they're growing faster, because their starting point was so much worse. Healthcare. They invested a ton in healthcare and, improving healthcare for the masses. So, healthcare was free in the Soviet Union, available to everyone. But it's still set there of an economy, whether it's state or private. And they had to deal with things like an aging population because how should I explain this? The Soviet Union invested heavily in women's education and rights. This led to women having fewer children, as often happens when you give women more choices than just being baby factories. As a result of this, women chose to have fewer kids. As a result of women choosing to have fewer kids and kids later in life in the Soviet Union, due to greater education, a lot more women pursuing PhDs than ever before in Russian history, for instance, and growth in the women pursuing PhDs outpacing the West for most of their history, for instance. They were much more aggressive about it, and they made great strides earlier. Obviously, later in the history, the West was growing a little bit faster because the Soviets had already done that. You can't keep growing things forever. Once you've developed it and women are pursuing it close to equal rates to men, and the only way you would keep growing faster is if your whole population was getting PhDs at more and more and more aggressive rates each year. It's not possible to outpace the West forever. But they reached a level that the West wouldn't reach for decades, much sooner, because of women pursuing scientific and engineering careers and architecture and stuff like this, having access to these professional jobs that in places like America, women weren't able to really enter until like 20 years later. This led to an aging population because of declining birth rates. And so the Soviet Union had to invest in social care for the elderly a lot earlier than the West did because, you always have to invest in it, but they had to invest proportionally a lot more. This is demographics. Of course, they had that problem better taken care of earlier, and if the Soviet Union collapsed, and with it all the social care system they set up, the Russia would have been much better positioned for the graying population. Where say the U.S. is dealing with that problem now, because now the American population is really grayed a lot. And anyone who knows anything about like nursing homes, that's what I mean by elderly care, social care, nursing homes, home care, these kind of things. This industry is full of corruption. It's full of really low quality care. Uh, the U.S. did not invest in these things. It left it up to the private sector, and the private sector, government did not invest in these things, and left up to the private sector. And the private sector did in the most cost-cutting, brutal ways possible that have resulted in some truly atrocious nursing homes. Like as an EMT, some of these places I would walk into, and you just smell piss and shit everywhere. The U.S. elder care system is horrendous. It's like a crime against humanity. I'm exaggerating a little bit, obviously, but it is. No civilized nation should treat its elderly that way. And the U.S. does. And if the Soviet Union lasted a couple more decades, it would have been very obvious how the U.S. elder care system was failing. Inevitably, this still would have happened whether the Soviet Union was around or not. And they could have pointed to that, and I think a lot more people in the Soviet Union would say, we don't want that. We don't want capitalism. But instead, the U.S. borrowed heavily against its future by not making certain investments that wouldn't come back to bite the U.S. until much later. Heavy deficit spending under Reagan. Basically, the U.S. made itself look impressive as possible in the 80s to the detriment of its future, and succeeded in convincing enough people in the Soviet Union that capitalism is a better system that the system tore itself apart. That plus the end of Bretton Woods, and Soviet Union did not fail because socialism can't work. It failed because the people in the Soviet Union stopped believing that socialism could work. And by the numbers, it was actually working reasonably well until near the very end. When Gorbachev came to power, he tried some aggressive reforms out of the belief that the Soviet Union was failing, even though they were in an economic crisis due to the end of Bretton Woods, but it probably would have passed if they just continued with business as usual. But Gorbachev was the belief the system was failing. As a result of that, he made aggressive reforms that were utter failures and destabilized the system and made things much, much, much worse. So, if not for Gorbachev's reforms, if he'd literally just played the China card, just do nothing, win, the Soviet Union would still be around. Obviously, China doesn't do nothing, but they just take a steady course and don't make sudden jerky moves of assuming that everything is bad just because things aren't working out immediately. There's much more stability in the way Chinese leadership leads their country. And that's a matter of culture and experience in government and things like that than it is a matter of socialism or anything that's inherent to it. Socialism is not going to express itself the same way in every country, in every time and place in history. Okay, but yeah, that's a long tangent. Socialism. How this started? It started, yeah, you don't have to know why something works to know it works. I don't have to know why everyone watches YouTube to know people watch YouTube. And I don't have to know that it's important I talk. Why it's important I talk to know that it's important I say something to you guys. Doesn't matter what it is sometimes. I swear I could talk about anything and I'd probably have viewers, but I'm trying to say things that are intelligent and interesting and hopefully add some value to your lives. Teach you guys something. Make you think a little bit. So, a quicker game like this, I do more of it because this game is just clicking, right? I mean, this is the Explore Money simulation in Cell Singularity, and it's particularly redundant. You hit this target, a box fills up with either seashells, coins, paper money. It gets a little different when you get to the electronic money stuff. When it fills up, you can pull a lever and you get a one-time. It feels very Skinner boxy. For those who've studied even a little psychology, you know what I'm talking about. Clickers often are, but this gets some views, and it's a game that requires very little thinking, which is good when my long COVID is hitting me hard, like after that hike today. So, like I said, I thought about doing a Rebel Link video. I just don't have the energy. And in fact, I'm going to bed after this. Let's see. River, if you're watching this, shout out. Left a lot of cool comments in my videos. I just want to repeat my appreciation for it. I guess you guys wouldn't even know that as different nicknames, usernames, different platforms, but one of my viewers across multiple and acquaintances and some I come to consider a friend across multiple platforms. So anyways, yeah, I hope I'm not sticking my phone mouth away, so that, or stepping in a jar of fat. What's that German saying? God, the exact wording, my long COVID brain, I can't think clearly. A discussion about this with someone, and I'm not gonna say who because I don't share everything on YouTube. I'm not going to put other people's privacy at risk. So, yeah, I'm not gonna say who I had the discussion with, but anyways, but I do know who. I'm not that unable to focus that I can't even remember. Anyways, so let's see here. I got the central bank node. The interest massively increases the value of the coin generators. Gold standards probably next, although that requires quite a bit of paper currency. And I don't think I have the brain power, even the energy left to even grind this that much longer. Plus, it's a 28-minute video, so it's already gone on a little long for Cell Singularity. That's probably why this series streams better, is because they're usually shorter videos. It should have been obvious to me from the beginning. Well, that's enough for now. I'm sure my ranking will fall between now and the next time I put like this. Viewers, I wish you all the best. Take care of each other. Be kind to yourselves, and may you always find a guiding star to lead you home. Until next time. This is Northstar. I do. Go get some rest. After, I guess, more of the Rings online dailies, I'll do a series on that at some point. Viewers, I do.